Da vil jeg påstå at vi er good to go.
Come in. I'm going to give a preposterous talk about the 10 Commandments revisited.
Are you recording? No.
Good. Should I just start? Should we just start? Or
It's 15 past.
Are you recording?
I have no clue.
We are recording.
Okay, we're recording. Good. So I'm going to talk about basically how to give a talk. Sorry? There's a comment on Zoom. Adam, can you take care of that?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Good.
It was me, actually.
So before we start thinking about that, so let's just take a pause and ask, what do you want to achieve with giving a seminar? It's useful to think through that first. Now, if you give a job talk, you obviously would like to have a job. But most talks are not job talks. They're just regular talks. So I think there's a big confusion about that. I think a lot of people think that the purpose of giving a talk is somehow that people will like your research topic or be impressed or something like that. Not true. The purpose of the talk is that people understand what you do, right? Because the purpose of the talk, if you're a grad student, say you would like, perhaps you like to, on the one hand, you like to convince people about the points you're making. On the other hand, you like to get good comments, and neither of them. If people are impressed by what you say, that doesn't help you in any of those. What helps you is that people understand. When people walk out that door, they should understand your main point. That's going to be the bottom line of this talk. So I've summarized this in 10 commandments. So now let's just go through each of them. So the first commandment, of course, is to prepare well. So you need to think through when you give a paper. So a paper, you give it many times, right? So when you present a paper, for example, at a conference, or when you give a job talk or something like that, or a seminar in a university, it's quite likely that some referees, for example, sit in the audience, and you cannot screw up. You have to, when you give a talk, it has to be a good one. So therefore, you have to prepare very well for it. I think what a lot of people do is they spend way too much time, up until the wire, working on the paper, because they think that people are going to read that before the seminar. Very few people do, because they feel like me that reading the paper before the seminar is like a bit like opening the presents before Christmas. I don't do either. So I wait for the talk and then see the talk, and then perhaps I read in the paper afterwards. So, but you should really give priority to the talk. So how do you do that? Well, you give many practice talks. Okay, even if you give a talk here, you could give a practice talk to yourself, or you could give it to some friends. You should go over every slide religiously and think about every slide. And later we'll talk about what you should think about when you go over those slides. I think it's also very important to, so economics is a bit special relative to many other fields in that, depending on what is considered to be a sin, or what is to be a forgivable sin and a non-unforgivable sin. So if you make a mistake in the paper, there is forgiveness for that. If there is some paper you don't know about that do more or less the same as you did, don't worry, there is forgiveness for that. You know, it's, that happens, especially if you think about a job talk. It's not such a big deal, because they don't hire you because of the paper. They hire you because they would like to hire you because of that they think that you would develop into a good colleague in future. So also, and it's not a very big deal if you forget to cite. If there's some paper you don't know about that you should have cited, you can do that. But I tell you what, there is no forgiveness for is if you don't understand your own paper. That people are brutal. So you should really make sure you understand. If you have a model, theory, you have to understand the mechanism in your paper, in your model. If you do empirical work, you have to understand what identifies the main effects. That just have to be there because you are going to be asked for it. And a talk can go well or bad, but when they ask you about the crucial thing about your paper, you should be able to answer. Yes. Okay, let's move on to the second commandment. Now we start to move on. So that was just before the talk. Now you enter the talk. You open the first. The first slide, of course, is the title of the paper, and then you arrive at the first slide. What do you do? Well, you have to state the question you're asking. I think it's okay to say some words in the beginning of motivating the board question, but you have to arrive very quickly to what question you actually ask. Why is that so important? It's not just because you have annoying people like me who ask that, but it's think about it. Research is about going through a forest, a thick one. And when you give a paper, you explain somehow a path through that forest. Face the facts. You are grad students, so you're not so good at giving talks. And very often you confuse people. So it really helps if people understand where you go, where you plan to go. Right? So if you start out by saying, my plan is to get to here and to go roughly like that. Okay? If people know that, they can, it's much easier for them to understand stuff, to questions, data you use, or if you say suddenly, I'm going to cross the river, that might come as, if that comes as a surprise, then you're in trouble. Because then they start thinking, why is he making this assumption? Why does he want to do this empirical work? If you state the question very, very clearly, that helps you. Because then people know what you're trying to do and they evaluate what you say in connection with that. And it's disaster if people don't understand where you're going and you try to go along that way and people ask you a question that takes you off the path. That's bad because you lose time and people get confused, and you don't want that. You don't want confusion. Think about what I said. The purpose here is that when people leave the door after the seminar, they understand your main point. And if you state the question early, it's a lot easier to understand that. Good. Now, if once you've stated the question and you're talking about the motivation, so I have to say, I like short motivations. There are two schools of thought, the long motivation and the short motivation school. The long motivation basically states motivation and lists up all the results in gore detail. There is a logic to that, in that you're thinking, oh, perhaps I will not be able to go through everything. And then at least I've stated the results in the beginning. My taste is not for that, because I like to understand things. And if I understand them, I remember it. If I don't understand, I forget it. So therefore, when people just say something, claim some results, it's very hard to relate to that before I know somehow in detail what they're asking. Now, when you motivate, obviously you have to motivate the paper, but when you motivate, the motivation has to be very tightly linked to what you actually do. Again, if you give one motivation that could be very good and you do something else, people get confused. And if you say something, it came as a surprise to me when I was a grad student, certainly. If you say something that's interesting and useful in the introduction, and then if you do something else, people kind of refer back to what you said in the beginning, and that's deadly, because then you get you will be held accountable for everything you say in the introduction. That's what you should think. So state the motivation with the very clear idea of what you're going to do afterwards. So the ideal thing, of course, is that you give a motivation that's interesting and so on, and that after that introduction, people can kind of, and the question you ask, people can kind of anticipate what you're going to do. That's the ideal situation to be. So part of that, of course, don't talk about stuff that you're not going to address. You can talk about that in the conclusion, but not in the introduction. It's very dangerous to motivate things, to give motivations that you are not following up. Now think about. So it's very common, especially in theory, to give an example. That's very useful. But the example has to be very tightly linked to what you're going to do later. If you give an example that's kind of interesting, but it doesn't fit the model, again, then you will be held accountable to the people are going to say, well, this model is not like the example you had earlier. Then it's too late to say, yeah, I didn't mean that example, I meant something else. You should make sure that the example fits like hand in glove with what you do. And it's better than to choose perhaps a less sexy example, as long as it fits to the point you're trying to make. Let me emphasize, it cannot be emphasized too much. The audience wants to understand what you do. And your job is to help them with that. All right. Now, with the idea of helping people to understand them, with the idea of helping people to understand what you do. Yes.
How do you feel about giving like a preview of results along with
I'm going to talk about it a little later. I think it's a very delicate. It's like crossing a field of quicksand. But I'll get to it. I'll talk about it now. What you have to do. So we're still in the introduction and the main body. Okay, but in the introduction, you want to somehow convey the main value added of what you do. That's very important, more than the actual results. You want to say my value added here, relative to what other people have done, or you might do many things, but my main value added, for example, is to take this model to the data, or my main value added is that I'm able to, test what this reform actually does, or something like that. Because if you state what the main value added is, first of all, that helps people. When you state that in the introduction, then people expect that that's what the model is going to be about. And if you say that my main value added, for example, is to test a particular theoretical mechanism, then they will expect that the model is built around that. And if you then, it's good that people expect somehow where you are going to put the emphasis. And then there are some other things that's outside of the main value added. And they might say, oh, you should have chosen a more realistic model. Yeah, I should have, but that's not my main value added. So that's why I choose to focus on this other stuff instead. That's completely okay. But if you say that my value added, for example, is to think about, is to write down a model of sovereign debt, if that's the, and think about, I don't know, what a country in crisis should do. If that's my main value added, then I cannot be cavalier when I think about assumptions there. Then people are going to focus their questions on that. Okay. Clarify your main contribution. It makes it easier for the audience to evaluate your paper and understand somehow where you put the emphasis on when you present it. Now, it's very useful. Another big advantage of taking a stand on what your main value added is that then you could, of course, when you write a whole paper, do a model and everything, you could, you have self-made, you could have self-made components along the way, everything. You can do that, but that's going to generate infinite confusion because people will not know. The way to write a paper is you want to make one point or you want to make one contribution, and to as much as possible, the stuff that's outside your main contribution, you should build on other people's work. Why? Well, because then people, since it's not your main value added, it's much better if you take it from the off the shelf. And when you present it, you should be very clear. So for example, imagine you want to do some political economy stuff. Studying, I don't the federal versus local competition, something. If you then, to do that, say you choose a off-the-shelf political economy model, then you have to be very clear about when you build on other people's work, because then you can be quick when you present. Now I'm building on, this is not my manual, I'm building on somebody else's work. Let me just describe how that model works. Then it's kind of understood that then you are only allowed clarifying questions. You cannot, it makes no sense if I say I'm going to build on, I don't know, a paper by Persson Tavolini. And let me just explain how that model works. Then you cannot, then the audience are not allowed to say, oh, I disagree with that model. So it helps you in terms of, because you win time. So you want that the critical questions people ask, they ask them about your value add. Okay, now literature review. Literature review should be short. It depends a bit on how long the seminar is. If the standard seminar is, say, an hour and a half, then obviously you have to have a chunk where you talk about the relevant literature. And the trick is perhaps to have, imagine you have 3 main contributions or something, and you touch onto 3 different literature, you write up some of those literatures. So they're on one slide, and you don't talk about each individual. And then perhaps you say, the paper is closest related to blank, and say how it's related. Now, in a shorter talk, like half an hour or 45 minutes, you don't have time to talk about the other literature. You can skip it. And the audience wants to understand what you do, not what the others do. That could be, of course, if you have a so-called literature-driven paper. If in order to understand the main contribution, you have to understand what somebody else did. Well, then obviously, you have to understand what they did. But that's how you should think about the literature review. It is a tool for you to convey somehow how you related what you do. So my advice is to do literature reviews very quickly and say relate a couple of papers. It's most related to blank, and move on. And in particular, don't spend time on explaining, somehow laying out. It's not, you're not teaching. It's a very different format from teaching. In teaching, you have many lectures. You could then obviously it's good that people understand the literature in general. In a seminar, you don't have time for that. If people don't know the literature, that's too late for you to teach them. You basically have to convey your paper building on the rest of the literature. When I said that you have to go over very carefully the presentation, you should think that there is an opportunity cost of every slide, an opportunity cost of time. So every slide has to have a purpose. And ideally, there should be a logical link, right? If you give a talk, this is especially problematic in the introduction. You give a talk and then suddenly a slide appears with a graph that people hadn't expected. Immediately we will attract questions. People start thinking, why is she putting this graph up? This comes as a surprise. So if it comes as a surprise, it must be very important. And then people start thinking, and then you detract them from what you so in other words, every slide has to have there has to be a clear. People expect that there is a clear path, and therefore every slide you give have to be related to the path you want to follow, and the logic and the logic you're following. So again, if there is a surprise, people get confused, and then they fall off, and then you lose them. That's bad. You don't want to lose them. The more logical the path is, the easier it is to keep the audience with you, especially those who are a bit outside your literature. They are very dangerous to lose, because if you lose them, they're gone. The people who know very well the literature, for them, they can kind of vaguely understand perhaps why you put that slide, although they understand that it's a bit of a detour. Don't do detours, especially not in the introduction. Now, here, of all the commandments, here is the one that really counts. It's a bit like the 10 commandments in the Bible. There's one commandment that's more important than anyone else. For the 10 commandments of giving a paper, it's this one. You want to convey what makes the model tick. Or if you give an empirical paper, you want to convey what identifies the main result. So if people don't understand that, you have lost. If people do understand it, you win. I said in the beginning that the goal is that when people leave the room, they understand your main point. And that's about this. So why is it so important? It's important first because people will only remember if they truly understand it. And they can only understand it if they understand somehow the main source of identification. Or the main aspect of the model that delivers the main result that you're trying to get. I understand that it's difficult, but it's when you write a paper, it's always what you. Of course, when you stand there giving the talk, it's a bit too late to think about it. But it's something you should think very hard about before you enter that room, and you should think very hard about it when you write the paper, and make sure that it's kind of the main mechanism is fleshed out. So in economics, we really understand, we really emphasize. So if you're a journalist somehow, reporting the facts is perhaps the mechanism doesn't matter so much, perhaps. But for us as scientists, it's the most important thing, more important than what results actually are. It could be that the mechanism itself is very interesting, in addition to of course the results. And remember what I said earlier, when thinking about, for example, hiring people, it's you want to and evaluating research, we really emphasize that the understanding of the main point, understanding the mechanism. Yes.
So from the applied or empirical perspective,
Yes.
the word mechanism is used very much to describe not how the average treatment effect comes about, but like through what channel.
Exactly, identification.
Yeah.
Exactly. To what channel? Exactly. So that's what you should. So you say, well, the result is this. Fine.
Yeah.
Now let's try to understand why that is.
Mm-hmm. So this is less about what variation in my data is creating this result.
That's too.
Mhm.
That is also very important.
Mhm.
I would think of identification as those two things. So it is very interesting to understand what variation delivers mechanically, what variation delivers the result. That's super useful, because I think only then can we understand the mechanism. Yeah. Good. And if people do understand the mechanism, I think then you can be happy. And again, don't be sad if you receive critique, as long as that critique somehow if the critique shows that they understood the mechanism, that's good. And then they can like it or not like it, but at least you convey the main point, and then you can only then, I think, can you get a valuable feedback. Now, when you give a talk, you are the manager. That's the implicit deal. You start there, you get to talk for a couple of minutes uninterrupted, and then people start to ask questions. That's a normal format, and it makes a lot of sense to try to finish a little before, so that because some people, they ask questions immediately, and then other people like to wait with the questions until the end. It can be a good idea to leave a little time in the end, to have time to go through. And it's very sad if you spend a lot of time in the beginning, and then when you get to the main points, you get very little time to explain it. So again, you have to think, you have to make, the aim is to convey the main point of the paper, and just make sure you have enough time for that. So how can you achieve that? Well, you keep the pace. And it's especially important in the motivation and introduction of the talk. Because, and that's why it's so dangerous that if that introduction it's a bit like crossing some quicksand. If you go through it sufficiently fast, it's fine. But if you're slow, you get stuck. And there's a negative dynamics. It's if you go slowly, and then people start asking some questions. Perhaps people in the literature, they get a little impatient. They ask some question. And then you start answering that. That triggers new questions. And before you know it, you deep down into the material of the paper. And those who are very much into the literature, they can kind of anticipate, kind of understand the discussion. But for the rest, they have no clue what you're talking about. It's a complete waste. And that's why you have to when you give that presentation, you have to, as when you go over quicksand, you have to go sufficiently fast. It's very dangerous to be slow. And because at some point you say, now I'm going to start to present the model, or now we go into the specific of the paper. In the empirical paper, we start talking about the context or something. Once you get there, then you're safe, because then again you're going to have a little time that you can talk uninterrupted, etc. So the point is, in the motivation, state the question, state somehow brief motivation very quickly on the literature, and perhaps say you can say what the results are going to be, but it has to be brief, and you have to keep in mind it has to be understandable to people who are outside the literature or who haven't seen the paper. So therefore, and emphasizing somehow the main contributions. Now, the fact that you're the manager, and you want to have, so it's useful to think recursively. Imagine you give a talk that lasts for an hour. If you think, I want to be done, I don't know, 3 minutes before, it means I have to get to the main points at least 15 minutes before the end. Okay, so and then you think backwards. That gives you an indication where you have to be in the talk at each of the different points. Try to follow that. What is very dangerous if you start talking an introduction. Usually people have very good time. They entertain questions and then suddenly you have very little time, and then you have to speed up. So it's your responsibility to keep the pace. And the trick is to if you go through them, as long as you keep the pace when you present, people understand somehow, especially towards the end of the introduction. Start to go quickly. People understand that now we're getting to the main model, so that they stop asking questions. But now imagine you're deep into the paper, you present, and you realize, now I don't have a lot of time. What do I do? You can cut stuff, because and when you write the slides, you should write them in such a way that it is possible to cut to the main point. And also when people ask questions, especially in the beginning, when people ask questions, imagine people ask questions are going to take you off track. And that is bad in every sense, not only because you lose time, but also because people things are attracted to the wrong things. It is okay to say, it's an interesting question, that takes us a bit away from what I want to talk about. I want to try to come back to that later, which of course is a lie, but it's possible to delay and say, or to say, if people start asking questions about if people start asking questions about the model mechanism and so on, I think it's good to say, those are very good questions. I realize I've spent too much time on the introduction. I will answer that in detail when I get there, because that is the main point of the paper. Let me now just and then you just cut to the chase and say there are some more results. We'll talk about them later. Now let me start about presenting the main paper. Yes. Oh, you didn't want a question? Good. Now, another way to keep the pace and to make sure you convey the main point, etc., is to not cover too much material. So there is a sense that you have to present everything you've done. No, you don't have to present everything you've done. You can have some stuff in as a backup. Just so you have some slides, and then there is some conclusions, and then you could have some stuff below there, in case people were to ask. You could say, well, that's interesting. In fact, I've done that, or I've done some robustness along the lines that you suggest. let me just go and show you that you can do. But you should present exactly the stuff. Remember, the lead star here is to present the stuff that make people understand the main point. Not more, not less. So basically, it means that you don't want to cram in too much stuff in the paper. Only enough to make people understand the main point. And by the way, I forgot to say, in the introduction, what people really don't want to hear is the history of thought of how you got to think about this question. Don't do that. It was just a waste of time. Spend time on the main point. Spend time instead on explaining what is the question you're asking. Finally, the last commandment is to answer questions well. That's a very difficult command to follow. So, because there's a lot of learning in terms of how to handle questions. Let me give some brief, some simple things, suggestions. So the first one is let people finish the question instead of sometimes when you guess what they're going to ask, it's very tempting to somehow start answering the question before they're finished. That is dangerous. It could be a little annoying for the one who has the questions, and also it could be that you answer a question that they didn't plan to ask, and it just adds confusion and wastes time. Let them state the question and then try to answer then. Now, there are 4 different types of questions, and you have to handle these different questions differently. The first one is basically clarifying questions. So you're most likely to get them when you go through somehow the main body of the paper. You should try to answer those as sharply and sharp and short. They just ask, is it, are you doing it only for men or both for men and women? A typical clarifying question. So that doesn't mean that you have to motivate why you do it for men necessarily, even though you think perhaps they do. But it, when people ask a clarifying question, it's good to try to just answer that and move on. So it's a little risky because it could, of course, be that they had in mind something deeper, but then they can ask that if they had in mind something else. Very often, they just wonder, do you do it for men, or is it men and women, or women, right? So just answer that.
Related to that, so it doesn't happen a lot, but there can be these kind of ambush questions.
Yes.
Right? And so that would ask you, do you do it for men or women or both? And then you say for both, and then suddenly it's used to sort of shoot down everything what you do because you're comparing apples and bananas here.
That's okay. That's okay. But then let them say that. Okay. It's much better, I think. So suppose you think I ask a question, you think, oh, it's an ambush question. And you say, oh, I do it for men, and let me just spend 5 minutes defending on why I don't do it for only men and not men and women. It could be that they're completely on board with the idea that it makes more sense to do it on a more narrow group, say. It's not clear, but if they want to make a point of it, then then let them make that point, and then you can have that discussion then. It's very important to answer clarifying questions sharp and quickly, especially if you're a junior presenter, because you're going to need the time. Now, there's another type of question that you really have to dig into, and you really have to answer them well. It's a question about the main mechanism and the main analysis. So for those questions, it's good to dwell. And then you dwell on that mechanism or that main point, that might attract other questions. That's not the problem. As long as the discussion is about your main mechanism, that's value added. That's value added. Clearly, it can be good for you because you understand more about what you've done and what others think, and it's good also for the audience. So that's not a waste of time. But spending a lot of time on a clarifying question, that's a waste of time. Then there are there are two more pesky ones. One is speculative questions. What if you had done something completely different? What if you had some more mechanism or some aspect in your model that's not in your model? Or you asked different questions or you used some different data? Very difficult to handle and a bit unfair, I must say, to ask those kind of questions to junior people. So I think it's okay. So what you have to avoid is to be outside of your comfort zone. You have to avoid guessing. If you don't know, it's much better to say, that sounds very interesting. At the moment, I'm not quick enough to think on my feet what the results will be. Let's talk about that afterwards. That's completely okay. Or it's okay to say, that's an interesting exercise. It's not what I've done. The talk is not so long. I'm going to focus on what I've done, and then we can talk about this alternative thing afterwards. People are fine with that. But again, if you earlier have stated very clearly what your question is, and you have conveyed what the main point is, then people are much more willing to accept that. But if it's unclear, if they think mistakenly that your main point is about something here, and you think it's something else, and they ask questions about what they perceive as your main point, then you're in trouble, because then they're not going to accept that you don't answer that question. Yes. Now the last one is what Johannes called ambush questions. I'll call it deadly questions. For example, this data, I don't think these data has any information about that. Or I think that your main mechanism is wrong. Then you have to fight. So if you think of the clarifying questions, that's not a place to fight. You just clarify. On the main mechanism, you entertain questions, you try to answer them as well as you can. For speculative questions, it's fine. You can give in and you say, yeah. I think you're right. You're right. That would be something very interesting. It's a mechanism or something to study. Very interesting for building on this work. That would be very interesting to go. I haven't done that so far, so let me talk about what I've done. But for the deadly question, there is that they pull the knife and you have to defend yourself, because if you don't defend yourself when they attack the main mechanism, then you lost. Because then they think, yep, that this paper is not worth anything. And then that's not where you want to be. All right. So all in all, questions are very useful, and you should make sure you write them down and think about them afterwards. Obviously, when you give the paper, you don't have time to write down those questions. So you make a friend. Always have a friend who's allied. So writes, Adam, and you write the question he asked. Ruslana, and you write the question she asked. That's very important. And then you go afterwards, you go back and you read through those. And you can then it's and then that's a good time to tax your advisor after a talk like that, to have a debrief when you talk through the comments you got, and then he or she can say, well, most of these comments are completely crap, forget about them, but this one you should think about. That was a comment. Good. That's all I had to say.
Yeah. Maybe I'm the one queuing and clapping. So you people online, also in the chat. Would people here have some questions?
Yeah, I would have one more
Yeah.
on how to manage questions.
Yes.
Because this is really related, in my experience, to keeping pace.
Yes, it is very related to keeping pace.
People can become offended if you abuse the strategy of postponing questions to the never happening later.
Yes.
But how do you do that? I mean, people can have very strong opinions on particular aspects that you're working on, while those might be idiosyncratic views. So on the one hand, you don't want to annoy them or offend them. On the other hand, you also don't want them to waste your time.
No, that's a very good point. And it illustrates a very big, a huge problem. Suppose you give a paper, and part of that involves doing something, implicitly stating that somebody else did something wrong, whether you do something else than what they did, and they burn for this. Then you will attract fire. So how do you deal with that? It's obviously difficult to give a generic answer, but I can say that as long as if you convey somehow the main question and the main value added, as long as people, and you stick to that, you say, well, we can probably do it different ways, but I don't. It remains to be seen how relevant it is for the main mechanism, or for the main point I'm trying to make. It's useful, actually. It's useful to think a bit what the audience is. So if imagine your work implicitly attacks somebody, and you are there, well, then there's no way. Then you have to confront that somehow, and it's useful to be polite. That the tradition in economics is when you refer to other people's work, you don't do it in a very negative way. You don't say, this paper has the wrong identification, something like that. The worst I've gotten to is, there was a paper that we studied exactly the same question with exactly the same data, and we found different results. What do you do then? Using the same methodology. Then you say, well, this paper has also studied, they find different things than we do. What can you do? That's at least that's a factual question, and then Good. So so now I am going to hold you accountable. If you don't get to that question sufficiently fast, or you don't convey some of the main value added, I will come back and haunt you. So, good.
Job talks and stuff. How should you
Sorry?
do for job talks and practicing for job talks and stuff here? Do you normally like depend on the other people, or how do you work?
Yeah, I think it's okay to do that, and I think it's also a time when you can really tax the advisor. The advisor should be able to with people together that it's time for them to burn some capital.
Would it be better to do it like multiple times with smaller groups, so you get to present several
I
times?
think
or-
that's a good idea. So if you think of so huge surprise to me. I spent some time in Minnesota at the Minneapolis Fed. And what was a big surprise to me was the extent to which people are prepared for the job market. So by the time they went for the interviews in December, January, they had already presented their paper perhaps 5 times, every single one. So don't be afraid of giving the same paper more times. Be afraid if you don't do any change, if you get fundamental change suggestions, and you don't do even correct mistakes, then people get a little pissed off. But it's useful to give a paper many times. And for the job market, the advisor expects to be taxed. Yep, Andreas, that's his job. He gets paid for it, so don't feel bad about. Don't feel bad about telling him, go in the market, could you please organize a job talk? And then he's going to do it. So, yeah.
Are there questions from Zoom, by the way?
No.
No?
No questions on Zoom.
All questions answered.
All right, I'm going down to get some food.
Thanks.